From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Please welcome James McBride.
You like me. You really like me. Thank you. So nice to see so many white people. Nice people here today. I really feel just wonderful. I should say that one of the people who brought this National Book Festival back that is rarely mentioned when talking about how we got here is Laura Bush. So let it be known that a librarian brought us together. And would that her party return to its former glamour someday soon. And I ain't kidding. In any case, I want to talk for another 4 or 5 hours about my new book that nobody read, and then I'll talk about The Color of Water. Now, I'll spend a few minutes. Is the timekeeper nearby? Okay, I'm going to spend like the first 5, 8 minutes talking about the James Brown book, and then I'll talk about The Color of Water and The Good Lord Bird, and then I'll open the floor to questions, because I know we don't have a lot of time. So a few years ago, well, not too long, my mother died in 2010, January 9th, 2010. And 6 months later, my ex-wife at the time, was my wife, decided that she no longer wanted to be married to moi. So that painful episode was really quite costly in many ways, particularly financially. So, well, emotionally as well. No kidding, cross my heart, hope to die still more forever. But so what happened was, I was working on the John Brown book at the time, and I got a call from somebody who was from James Brown's family. Essentially, I got a call from a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy. And I ended up meeting, a couple of members of James Brown's family who basically just begged me to take on this book. And I first turned it down. I said, it's just too much trouble, because James Brown left all of his money. His worth was between $100 and $150 million. He left it all to educate poor black and white children in South Carolina and Georgia. That was 10 years ago. Well, now you can start crying after applauding, because since that was 10 years ago, December 25th, 2006, and more than 10 years ago that happened, he laid his will out, and to date, not a single dime of that has gone to a single kid. And that's because his will has been tied up in court in South Carolina, which is like a different country, really. And so one of his relatives really wanted to spring that out. They wanted to free that money up to, essentially it was his oldest son, Terry, and his grandson, Philando. And so they asked me to take it on. At first I turned it down, and then I later agreed to do it, and so I took it on. But what happened was I spent, 2.5, almost 3 years fooling around in South Carolina. It was very difficult because, first of all, many books have been written about James Brown. And secondly, James Brown is he is absolutely impossible to categorize for a lot of reasons. But his life really is a metaphor for how we can't handle race in America and why we can't get along. Because here's a guy who, during the course of his life, really revolutionized American music. And I'll just give you a crass, sort of a cheap example that musicians will say, this is horrible. But this is the blues. The blues goes like this. Ba-doom, doom, 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 doom. One chord, doom, doom, one chord. Then you go to the 4 chord, doom, doom, to the 4 chord. Then you go back to the 1 chord, doom, doom, doom. And guess you go to the 5, then you go to the 4, then you go to the 1, doom, 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 ba-doom, and then you do it again, right? Well, when you sing the blues, when you play the blues, drummers play, if you're just playing fatback 1950 blues, the drummer's playing the hit on 2 and 4. He's going doom, ta, doom, da, doom, ta, and he's playing that hit like that. What James Brown did in his music was that instead of going to the 1-4-5, which he did in altered tones and in altered times, thanks to Pee Wee Ellis and Fred Wesley and some of his other musicians, including Maceo Parker's brother, who teaches here in Washington, D.C. I can't remember his name. But what he did was that he started creating music with, instead of the beat laying on on the 2 and the 4, it would fall on the 1 of the third bar. So it's go boom, da da doom, dum, dum, da da dum, boom, da da dum, da da dum, da da boom. And so that sort of rise and lilt was actually previously unknown in the R&B world. And it sounds like a small thing, but I remember when one of the great jazz drummers that played with Charlie Parker went to South Africa, went to Senegal to play. I heard this story from a Senegalese musician. I can't remember the drummer's name. He's still alive. But he went to play, and he was playing with an African troupe. And there was an African troupe, like 10, 12 drummers, and they were playing together, and they were going, brap, boom, boom, brap, boom, boom, boom. And this guy had his set out, and this is one of the greatest jazz drummers. I can't remember his name at the moment because there's so many of you here. But, and so the leader nodded to him to tell him to come in on the 1. And this guy, he was listening, and 3 times he tried to come in, and the third, he just couldn't, so he threw his sticks up and laughed and just got up. And the drummer, the lead drummer said, he motioned to the drummers, and he backed them off, and they showed him where the 1 was. And then when he got into where the 1 was, he just went crazy because he found this freedom in the sophisticated syncopation of what African drummers are capable of doing. What James Brown did was he managed to take the business of rhythm, not James Brown and the musicians in his band, most of whom, by the way, were from the South. They took this confined element of the 1-4-5 blues and using just the 1 chord, staying on the 1 chord, they found ways to create a rhythm that we still hear today in hip-hop music. Another one who did it to great effect was Grover Washington Jr. When you hear this boom, 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 that was created by a saxophonist from Philadelphia named Grover Washington Jr. But it wasn't as widespread as James Brown's music, but it's still heard in a lot of hip-hop music. And to show you how advanced James Brown was and to show you how much musicians really respected him, I asked Grover, I worked with Grover Washington. I wrote a couple of songs for him. I played piano in a couple of songs in the studio, and I asked him, I said, how come you never played with James Brown? Because Grover's a funky saxophone player. He said, he laughed. He said, James Brown, he said, I wasn't funky enough. And Grover Washington, of course, was plenty funky. But James Brown's musicians created a sound that is now known, around the world. And the irony is that James Brown never even made the cover of Rolling Stone magazine until he died. He was always seen as like the scream at the end of the dial. But his music encompassed everything. He recorded with Oliver Nelson, who was a pioneer jazz arranger. He recorded jazz songs, blues. His career encompassed the entire, a gigantic spectrum of musical life. And so his catalog is worth a lot of money. But unfortunately, his personal life was a shambles. And for that reason, his will and his estate has been tied up in court in South Carolina for 10 years. And ironically, the only person that has been following up James Brown's will and his estate, and you can read all about her, is a 63-year-old white grandmother from Newberry, South Carolina, named Sue Summer. And the authorities down there, when I say the authorities, the lawyers, the cadre of powerful attorneys, including the Attorney General and the other judges that are involved, they all have a little hand in this because it's all, I give you a little, you give me a little, you know how it works. This is Washington, D.C. They tried to lock her up twice. The freedom of she drops a lawsuit for freedom of information, and they try to get her notes, and they've threatened to put her in jail 2 times. One time they delivered a subpoena while she was putting her 2-year-old grandchild to sleep. And so that's, what really needs to happen in the case of James Brown is that the Department of Justice or some federal agency needs to move into South Carolina and say, this is what the guy wanted, and why is it not happening? And if that doesn't happen, it's just going to continue because it's a gigantic cow that can be milked. They're just milking the estate. They drop a loss. This one has to read the book. He's charging because he's got to read the books on James Brown. So this one, they need to analyze this so they get this law firm. And it changed my perspective about the world. My mother was a person who really marveled at stuff that was like, that you would marvel at because she really enjoyed having a car. She just thought that was like the coolest thing. Like if you just give her a new car, there's nothing. When The Color of Water became a big success, I just bought her a car. She thought I had just like given her the United States Treasury, really. But she had this innocence and the quality of wonder about things that all of her children have. And it's in part because I did this James Brown book. It robbed me of that sparkle for a while. It's come back now, only because I haven't read the book and I don't look at it no more. But it's hard to think that people will allow such depravity to go on. Just guys in suits with nice shoes and ties, it's just ripping this guy off. It's terrible. And the irony is that the children of South Carolina are among the poorest in this country. The other thing to remember is that James Brown really is not so much a child. He's portrayed in the media as a guy who grew up in, if you saw that movie, which was about 40% fiction, he grew up in a cabin. And I'm a little bit done with the whole business of black folks or poor white folks growing up in cabins. They're just sitting there, eating grits. And aren't some of them shy, or some of them are allergic to this or that and the other? And some of them, don't the brother pick on the sister? Aren't they normal to some degree, please? Well, what happened with James Brown was his family was from a section of South Carolina called, where the federal government, along with GE and GE and DuPont Company, decided to create something called the Savannah River Nuclear Site. And what they did was they chose an area where there was a river, where there were not a lot of people with power, and they just simply moved 6 towns, 300 square miles of area. They just made all the people move, and they created the Savannah River Nuclear Site, which is really where they create bombs, where they process plutonium and uranium to make nuclear bombs. And that's how James Brown became displaced. So when you see him in the cabin in the woods, he was in the cabin in the woods because his family was a family of sharecroppers that had lived there for several generations. That entire area of all those poor people, including white farmers and businesses and hundreds of businesses, post offices, schools, everything, they were moved. And this happened in 1951. And while there's a record of, in fact, Life magazine bit off a really telling, touching story about a school teacher whose class had to move, building moved, and the children watched it go, and they swore they were staying there. Their grandfather was buried there, and so forth. There wasn't a peep of a noise made about the 8,000 some odd black sharecroppers who were displaced. And the majority of people who were displaced by this nuclear bomb-making facility were poor blacks from that area. And James Brown's family was among them. So in many ways, he's a child of the nuclear age. And then, of course, he became a great star, and he created this revolutionary sound. And that's it. And the book is basically my journey to discover James Brown in a way that people haven't done before. So it's not a biography. Like, how you go to the bookstore and you read a biography, and then you go to the back to see how the guy died. It's not one of those types of books. Basically, I talk to people who knew him very well and show the world from their perspective, like Miss Emma Austin, who knew James Brown for 40-some-odd years. And I'm talking about bright, deep people who really understood him. Sue Summer, of course, Mr. Charles Bobbitt, who managed James Brown for years and also managed Michael Jackson. And, of course, Pee Wee Ellis. Pee Wee Ellis is the guy who wrote Cold Sweat. He wrote a lot of jazz standards. For those of you who are jazz musicians, if you know who Jaco Pastorius is, the bassist, Jaco Pastorius has a really famous song called Chicken, which everybody thinks Jaco Pastorius wrote, but he did not write it. Pee Wee Ellis wrote it. Pee Wee Ellis is an extraordinarily gifted tenor saxophonist who studied with Sonny Rollins and entered James Brown's band in around 1964. And if you hear James Brown's music after 1964, that's where he makes this big evolution. And that's because James Brown would go into his rehearsal and he'd say, I want to do that like that. And Pee Wee would just translate it to the musicians. When I was a kid, we used to make fun of James Brown. I said, I'll be James Brown, you be the translator. You think I'll give a skittle hat? James Brown said, you have to go over and give me some. But he was enormously talented. He was a great artist. And we forgive a lot of our artists for what they do. We can't seem to forgive James Brown for what he's done, because his marriage was a mess. At the end of his life, he had drugs. The guy never did drugs or drank or smoked most of his life. At the end of his life, he did all those things. He certainly did drugs. And the reason why is because he had seen that he just destroyed so much that behind him. And he wanted so much for his community. This is a guy who lived, 10 miles from where he was born after he died. When James Brown died, he could see the towers of the Savannah River nuclear site from his front porch. And he used to tell Charles Bobbitt, his manager, he said, look at them. You see them towers, Mr. Bobbitt? He said, that's the government. They're listening to me. They're listening through my teeth. He had lost his touch with reality in so many ways. But at bottom, despite the fact that his band disliked him intensely, and despite the fact that he did not love women, James Brown loved music. He didn't love women at all. He wasn't capable of truly loving a woman. Despite all that, I don't know of any other star that I can think of that has left every penny he made to educate poor children in his state and the neighboring state. It's a very unusual thing. And it's because he felt at the end of his life that we had not finished the job. And frankly, you and I know that he's right. So on that somber note, I'll not tell you some Milton Berle jokes, and we'll just all... No, are we past the 8-minute mark or whatever? Oh, the timekeeper was hypnotized. She just... Well, a few notes about the good Lord Bird. Color Water first. I explained to you that my mother died in 2010. She lived a very good life. She was 88 years old. She died at home. She waited till all the kids came before she died. Like my brother Hunter had just gotten married. She waited for him to get married. And he got married. He went to Puerto Rico or something like that. And she, it was clear that she was dying. And so she waited till he came back home, and he saw her, and then she passed away. She was actually, she was planning to see that movie. What's that movie with the cartoons? The cartoon characters and the real characters together? It begins with an A. Huh? No, not Roger Rabbit. Yeah. No, it's some movie. It was Avatar. Yeah, she was planning to see Avatar like the week she died. Like she was like, well, we're going to go see Avatar. I'm like, I don't think so, Ma. But, it was horribly difficult. She's buried in North Carolina in the Colored Cemetery there because when my father and my grandparents got buried, they were buried in the Colored Cemetery, which is now closed to all newcomers. So even in death, my mother is like, she integrated. She's like the only white person there. I was like, oh, boy. But, when I pulled up to that cemetery and I saw her coffin, it was like surreal. I said, this is not really, but it was real. But I'm grateful to her. And, it's funny because yesterday or Thursday, I got the National Humanities Medal from President Obama. I got it from him himself. Well, I didn't mention it so you could, there's a lot of people who are more qualified, but they called me. I said, okay, I'll take it. But I was sitting like right in the front, and I saw him talking, and I said to myself, man, I wish my mother could see this, And I bet you, I said to myself, I bet you he says that every once in a while, He's a gracious dude, man. He knows. You could see, like when he did it, you could see he does this a lot, but that he gets a little pleasure out of doing it every time. I know politicians are very skilled at saying, hey, how's the kids? But you could see he really enjoys it. And people they just love him in the White House. They really respect him. And we're going to, you're not going to miss him because he said himself, I'm not going anywhere. The world's not going to end after November 9th, unless Donald Trump wins. But, I really feel, no. I'm just kidding. Look, I just finished reading William Shirer's book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and the parallels between Adolf Hitler's rise and Donald Trump's rise are truly disturbing. William Shirer was a truly good, really great writer. And by the way, for those of you interested in writing, he was a radio reporter. But the reason why the book is so good in part is because, it takes the linear approach to this event, to this evil genius, but the reporting is so deep. The reporting on the book is so deep. moving to the good Lord Bird, I must have read maybe 25 books about John Brown. I initially wanted to write a book about Abraham Lincoln, but then, you know, I just couldn't do it. I mean, it's been done so well before, you know. And then I wanted to write about slavery in a way that made people laugh, and that brought, because, you know, Americans are very funny people. Like, we're really good people. I mean, I know all of you ain't, but most of you are very, very good people. No, but we like to, I wanted to write about slavery in a way that would show people what it was like without making them feel like they're taking their medicine. Because every time I read one of these books about, you know, what happens, and not every time, but, you know, you read these books about black history and you go, I know what's going to happen. You know, why do I not care? Let me see. You know, did the Knicks win? I mean, because you kind of know what, and that's not really a way to tell a story, because what you have to really tell is like, okay, the Iraq War went on. We were all here. Everybody was here when all this, you know, when all this heavy policing business went on, and, you know, the jingoism, the yellow journalism, you have to salute the flag and pretend you know. How many people actually stood up and said, you know, I mean, Terry Gross, how many people other than Terry Gross said, you know? So I wanted to write a book to show people how powerful slavery is and how slavery makes slaves of us all. One of the good things about this era in which we live is that white people have finally come to the realization, many, not all, but many have come to the realization that if we don't solve this problem of racism, we really are in for a long day. I remember when I was in college, we'd have these talks about racism, we'd meet about something, and it'd be like 8 blacks, 2 whites, and we'd have a long talk, and then everyone, but now, it's not that way. Now more white people are seeing what the deal is. In any case, the only reason why I wrote about John Brown's, you know, wrote the book and created the character of the Onion was because I didn't think I could write about a girl, really. I just didn't feel qualified to write about it from a girl's perspective. So I said, well, if it's a boy pretending to be a girl, then I won't look so bad. So I did that, and then I love what John Brown tried to do. I love it when someone stands up and says, this is what I represent. And it's really, you know, it was beyond benevolence for him. It really felt in his heart that black people were equal. And, you know, that really must have made him seem crazy. And the historians who've written about the period, at least until the last 10 years or so, treated John Brown like he was crazy. And he probably was a little bit dysfunctional or had some sort of schizophrenia, you know, something. We all got a little taste of something. So anyway, I just wanted to make it funny, and I'm so glad that it reached people, and it's been a delight. It's been a really nice ride. Well, we have to open the floor to questions now, so you know, feel free to ask questions, and if you have them, you know, you can ask any question you want. You know, I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you have. Is that the mic guy or a question guy? Okay, yes? You have a question? Oh, okay. Well, all right, you go ahead and I'll repeat it. Okay. The question was, James Brown was an entrepreneur. He had a radio station and know a lot about that. He was an entrepreneur, but he wasn't a very good one. He had 3 radio stations, one in Baltimore and one in Augusta and one, I think, in Tennessee. But he really wasn't that good a businessman. He didn't know how to run a business. He didn't know how to delegate authority. And he wasn't a great businessman. Yes?
Hi, I was going to ask you to speak a little bit about how you came to write Song Yet Sung, and who are some of your favorite writers?
Okay, well, I wrote Song Yet Sung because I became a fan of Harriet Tubman and wanted to dramatize her life in a way that I thought was interesting. And also, I wanted to kind of have a perspective of, if a slave woke up now and heard some of the violence in today's hip-hop music, so-called hip-hop music, what would he or she think? So that was the impetus to do it. Some of my favorite writers are the normal ones, you know, Toni Morrison and Faulkner and I read everybody. I read a lot of history books. Leon Litwack is a favorite of mine. He wrote Been in the Storm So Long, and I think Trouble in Mind. I just told you about William Shirer. I read mostly history books. Okay, yes, next question.
First of all, I just want to thank you for The Color of Water. It was very impactful for me in my life, and I want to thank you for telling your story to us. Secondly, I didn't know a lot about James Brown, but as you're talking, it reminded me of having read Charles Dickens's The Bleak House, and also Franz Kafka's The Trial. And I'm wondering, trying to connect these different worlds and different periods of history, whether there's some universal link between what James Brown went through and is going through now with his estate and what it tells us about human nature. I just throw it out there because as you're talking about it, it just, things were going off in my head. So what do you think James Brown's experience with his estate tells us about our human nature?
That's a very good question. We are a society that have become so litigious. Is that the right word? Sorry, attorneys here. I know a third of you are attorneys, and I truly apologize. I'm not trying to. Everything I say, I don't mean, and I take it back before I say it. But what has happened is that we're a society where, look, in a society where you rob people of their culture, where you take people's cultural richness and then sell cereal with it and beer and soft drinks to make money. The result is going to be what happened to James Brown's estate, where people try to sue it so they can get a new car and better house and more. I mean, it's part and parcel for life that happens in the music business. I covered Michael Jackson in 1984 when he was doing his victory tour. We came to Robert Kennedy Stadium. Man, you should have seen him dance in those. I mean, he was just unconscious. And he was surrounded by a bunch of, people who just didn't care about him, People who cared. Don King was one of those who sucked off the cow in those days. The only one who cared about him, really, were his brothers and his mother. I have tremendous respect for Michael Jackson's mother. I don't talk about her publicly, but Mrs. Catherine is a very good mother. She raised 10 kids in Hollywood, and they stuck together. I think she did a very good job. So the short answer to the young lady's question is, and she's very young. You're young. You are young. Well, is that people will do evil things. I think it's not so much what people do, it's our response to their evil that counts, because we can't control them. I hope that answered your question at least a little bit. Yes?
Okay. Hi, I'm Naomi, and I have two questions. The first is, your mom was I don't think she was a Holocaust survivor, but she came from that part of the world that was persecuted, right?
Yeah.
And I know that she converted.
Right.
You had a great book. My mom loves that book. My mom's a Holocaust survivor. And I wanted to thank you for that, but did she at all identify herself with being Jewish or formerly Jewish, or did she just basically pack that away and...
Well, when you say identify yourself with, it's not an easy word to really, what's a Jew? What's black? I think, I'll put it this way. When my mother converted to Christianity, she thought she had walked away from Judaism forever. And in many ways she has. She never turned back. But then on the other hand, my sisters, a couple of them, were interested in Judaism. She encouraged them to study Judaism. And a couple of my nephews as well. She said, look, it didn't work for me, but it's a beautiful religion. That's about as close. I mean, she's got to know her sister. She came full circle in terms of her bitterness towards Judaism because she saw it through the prism of her father's brutality. But me personally, just so you know, I really couldn't care less which religion you are. I mean, I was raised in the Baptist church, and but you won't see me going to see, some of these mega preachers taking poor people's money like some of these numbskulls. You won't see me doing that. I think of a person as a Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist. It's all the same, Love somebody. Doesn't really matter. Listen, religion is ripping us apart now. It's ripping the world apart because people who run around claiming to be Muslims, they're not Muslims, they claim to be Muslims, are murdering innocent people. John Brown was a Christian. He claimed he was a Christian. And some people called him a terrorist, but he didn't kill innocent children. He fought with people who were his size. So we have to be careful with this whole business of religion. You can't use it as a baseball bat. But it was a very good question, ma'am, and I hope I answered it.
The one I really wanted to ask you about was Song Yet Sung. Can I ask you one question about that?
Go ahead.
Thank you. You did a lot of your research in Dorchester County, and I did the whole Underground Railroad tour, and it was amazing. I have a place on Tillman Island. Were you able to get there?
Yeah, I got to Tillman Island. Yeah. You know, very nice, very nice. Yeah, I never saw that area from the prism of today. I always saw it from the prism of the 1850. So, but I did see it. I did enjoy it. Very beautiful area. Should I go to that side now? Go ahead, please.
Hi. I recently read The Good Lord Bird for a book club, and I was actually very surprised by how funny it was. And I want to thank you for that because I think it made the reading experience much more enjoyable for me. It's a very heavy topic, of course, but I think the little bits of humor really sort of, you know, it helped to tell it in a way I thought that was new and different. But I will say it made a lot of the members of my book club very uncomfortable in some areas, particularly with the Frederick Douglass portrayal, but yeah.
Well, it was just so funny. That's the only reason why I made the Frederick Douglass thing portrayal. It was just so funny. I couldn't resist.
Well, my question is, you talked about Onion, which of course is our main character in the book, and Onion is a boy who's mistaken as a girl, and you talked about not feeling qualified to tell the story from the perspective of a girl, and I wonder why you were interested in telling it from that perspective to begin with. What was sort of your thinking behind that?
Well, that's a good question, because during slavery, and even now in American society, black women, they live in a place that is, they're like dinosaurs. They walk alone. They're really at the bottom of everything. I mean, I'm not trying to put words into the mouth of black women here, so if I say it wrong, I truly apologize. Dominus Somus, E pluribus unum. But so I wanted the world of slavery seen from the prism of a little black girl, because they were the ones who were the least powerful. But I didn't feel qualified to write about it. Like, I don't know how to do hair. I don't understand the power of hair and how you look, you know. As you could see, what does hair mean to me? Hair means nothing to me. Nothing, my friends. So that's why I chose that approach. Yes?
I too am from Barnwell County, and your synopsis was very succinct regarding the Savannah River site and all the other things going on there. My question to you has to do with your reading history. Are there particular books that influenced you, and if so, in what way or how? Is there a particular book or books that stand out in your mind? Thank you. As a reader?
That's a good question. Not really. No, but only because I read so much. And everything I can only remember the last thing I ever read, you know, which in this case was the William Shiver's book. You learn when you're a writer and you've been a journalist that you have to read between the lines, and that there's no such thing as real subjectivity. Even William Shiver's book kind of short shrifts the whole business of what was happening to the Jews during Hitler's rise. Because Hitler was brutal toward the Jews from the very beginning, from Mein Kampf on out. And I don't know really what his true response to it was when he was in Berlin, because I just have a hard time believing anybody who was walking around Berlin did not see the brutality that was happening to the Jews there. So you learn to read between the lines. That's the short answer to your question. But I don't have a specific book that I do. Some of the William Still slave narratives, some of the slave narratives from William Still still stick in my heart. You know, the first person accounts, the slaves, African Americans talking about their lives as slaves stick in my heart. But no specific book. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I guess at the heart, I'm curious why you decided to become an author. What drove you?
So go to the mic. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I guess I'm curious as to what drove you to write. I mean, what was it that made you say
that particular book, or in general?
In general.
Well, let me think now. What drives me to write? Let's see. I don't know. Very difficult question. very tough, very difficult question. Try it. Look, when I was working as a journalist, I used to say to myself, I can't tell the whole story here. You got one of my first stories was about a warehouse fire in Wilmington, Delaware. I was a cub reporter, just finished Columbia, and I was a cop reporter in Wilmington News Journal, and they sent me out to do a fire about, like, just a normal house fire. And I stood there with my pad, and I'm watching the house burn down. I'm talking to the cops. Oh, man, this is, how many? Okay, 4-alarm fire. And I went back, and I wrote, like, 10-inch story, and I said to myself, this is not really what happened. Something else happened, like maybe the landlord didn't pay or maybe the tenant just got drunk, or the kerosene, there's more here. And as I got older, the story just kept I just began to see the stories getting bigger and bigger, and there was no creative way as a journalist to tell it. And so when I was about maybe 28, 29 years old, I was working at the Post. I quit. I just quit. I moved to New York. I was overwhelmed, and I just played saxophone and wrote music for 9 years. I wrote songs for Grove Washington, Anita Baker, and wrote songs for Barney, and I wrote a couple of musicals that failed. Yeah, I wish I wrote the I Love You song. I wouldn't even be here, okay? So, I would not even be here, all right? But I did not write that. And then, and during that time, I wrote The Color of Water. I wrote it when I was, playing in Jimmy Scott's band in the back of vans with guys smoking weed, and I never told anybody that I was writing about my mother, I never told anybody I was doing anything. I just was like so happy to get the gig, I would just be quiet. And then the book came out, and it didn't sell right away. It wasn't like an instant. In fact, it was reviewed with every other, poor mixed race mulatto book that showed up that month. Divided Soul, Bagels and Chicken, Color of Water. It was all this, But what happened was women started reading it, young Jewish women aged like, 20 to 80, young. And they just started putting it in their book clubs. And then you haven't lived until you've been to like a Coffee Klatch book club in Teaneck, New Jersey. Really. And they said, let's check his teeth. Let's check his teeth. Okay. Yes, sir?
First of all, you are a mesmerizing speaker. You used the word mesmerizing. I tried to take notes. I just got wrapped up in what you're saying. But my question is, as far as I know, one of your books, Miracle of Santa Ana, was made into a movie. What did you think of it? Do you think it was true to the book?
Yeah, as true as it could be. I mean, you only have 2 hours, in this case, 2 hours and 46 minutes to, because Spike Lee does what he feels like doing. Yeah, I thought it was pretty true to them. I mean, I'm not one of those writers that say, they cut my characters. I'm so happy they're doing it that, I'm not real picky about it. So I was glad that the movie at least, accurately reflected the general push of the book. I was disappointed, of course, when it was a flop, but, and I'm sure all of you've seen it, and I'm glad. I really am. It's my heart, just, I'm crying. So. But, so, it's all right. I mean, I have the greatest job in the world. I mean, I get to write, I get to put, words on the page, and people actually like pay me for it. So I wasn't disappointed. All righty. Over here, sir?
Yes, thanks very much. Bringing you back to The Color of Water and what one of the previous persons said about what moved you to write the book. You just seemed to, a moment ago, say, I was in New York, I was playing jazz, and I started to write this book about my mom. I don't think there's a person in this room who wasn't moved by that book. So what was it that moved you to say, I got to put this down on paper. I got to tell the story of my mom and how
that's
she
a good, I mean,
raised it.
fair enough. At one point in New York, when I was in New York, I was living in Fort Greene. That's during the great, Renaissance when Branford Marsalis and Spike Lee, these guys were all walking around, Talani Davis. I didn't know any of these people, by the way. I've always walked alone. But I was teaching English to Polish refugees a place called St. Stanislaus, which was a Catholic church in Williamsburg. And the guy who ran it was a Catholic guy. I forgot, his first name was Raymond. I forgot his last name. And the sister who ran it was kind enough to hire me. And you have to remember, I went from the Washington Post, from being a style reporter, going to the White House, Reagan, you know, writing my little stories, and then just teaching, standing in front of like 30 students, teaching English. And these were hard-working Polish people, really hard-working, who came to America fresh off the boat. You know, that's kind of a pejorative term, but you know, it's a derogatory way of describing their journey to America. But they just arrived. Most of them were cleaning houses. Some of them were very educated. And somehow or another, the whole business of Jewish people came up. I can't remember. I guess I was teaching a class, and the response was, you know, someone cracked a joke, and then it was like, I said to myself, like, you know, what difference does it? I mean, what do you know? And we talked about it a little bit, and I was a little bit disappointed in some of the responses to the whole business of what Jews are supposed to be. Now, this is in 88 or 89? And in some ways, it was more of like what was not said than what was said. And that got me to thinking, and then I just, you know, you live in New York, you see the Hasidic Jewish community, which is basically a very shy group of people. I mean, they're seen as like these, you know, I don't know how people see the Hasids in New York. But, you know, when someone complains to me about the Hasidic people buying a house, buying an apartment, and breaking up into apartments, buying a building and breaking up into apartments, and charging you lots of rents, all of a sudden it's like a Jewish thing. Now, if a guy from Greece does that, well, he's just a bum landlord. But, I mean, most of these guys, it's not like they're like Donald Trump ripping off parts of the city and like these giant developers and selling, you know, apartments on Columbus Square for $30 million to some Turk or some Russian. And they're hustling trying to make it. So I just kind of evolved into this whole the sensibility of what difference does it make? And then I just started thinking about maybe I'm thinking this because I'm Jewish myself. No, I just started to come into this sensibility of what it must be like to be truly Jewish in New York at that time. And so I started going around talking to my mother about where she came from, and she resisted, and the more she resisted, the more curious I became. And then when I went to Suffolk, Virginia, and heard the old Jews from Suffolk talk about what life was for Jews in the 1930s in Suffolk, I really came to it. And I said, this journey is no different than that of African Americans. And the skin color, yes, but the journey is the same. And it's a journey, and I'll close by saying that journey is the same for Italians and Irish, and it's the same for Mexicans and Ecuadorians and Indian people, Pakistani people, Chinese, Asian, Korean. It's the same. And if we are foolish enough to close our doors to people who don't look like us, we are closing the door to tomorrow. I will close with that. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.